Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Big Track Conference for Teachers. It's a pleasure to be here today. The Big Track Conference for Teachers initiative of Richmond dedicated to students, to teachers development, and aiming at updating the new methodologies. My name is Isaura Valverde. I'm the editorial manager at Richmond. And today it's a pleasure to share this experience with Antonieta Megali. Hi, Antonieta.
Hello, Isaura. Thank you.
Antonieta holds a PhD in applied linguistics from Unicamp, completed a doctoral internship at University of Viadrina, Germany, and has a master's degree in applied linguistics from PUC São Paulo. She is currently the Bilingual Education Graduate Program Coordinator at Instituto Singularidades, where she also works as a professor of the undergraduate program in education. She teaches at the course Bilinguals, Review and Theories and Data Analysis from PUC, and is collaborating professor of graduate programs in the South and Midwest. She's member of the Bi-Multilingual Education Study Group from PUC São Paulo, and she also works as a counselor at school. So our theme today is Translanguage about, with, through code and computing, and our guest is Sarah Vogel. Sarah is PhD, is a recent graduate of the Urban Education Doctoral Program at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She studies the intersection of computer science education, bilingual education, and social justice pedagogy. A former New York City public school bilingual teacher, come September, Sarah will become a postdoctoral fellow on a project she co-founded in 2017, participating in literacy and computer science, a National Science Foundation funded project which aims to leverage and diverse language practice of bilingual youth as resources in their computer science learning. She holds a master's degree in bilingual education from the City University of New York Hunter College and a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies from Columbia University. Welcome, Sarah. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for accepting our invitation.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to work again with Antonieta as well. Thank you to both of you for having me.
Thank you. So before starting our conference, I have some messages during the transmission. There will be some links available on the comments. So you have already received the link for our second book, Desafios e Práticas na Educação Bilíngue, organized by Antonieta Megali. Enjoy and share the link with your friends. Know more about the graduate program, Educação Bilíngue, Desafios e Possibilidades at Instituto Singularidades. I highly recommend it. And there is a raffle today for the exclusive live with the authors from the book Desafios e Práticas na Educação Bilíngue. Check the winners from yesterday. You can be one of them. Get your certificate of participation after answering our survey. It takes just a few minutes. So enjoy this opportunity. Send us your questions, ideas, reflections. Our guests will answer them. So is everybody ready? Antonieta, shall we begin?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We are very happy, as Isaura has already said, to be here with you. And thank you again for having accepted to have this talk with us. Sarah has just ended her doctorate at the City University of New York. I had the pleasure to watch her virtual thesis defense and her innovative research aimed at understanding the experiences and language practices of emergent bi-multilingual K-12 students during computing activities. So, Sarah, we are very glad that you have accepted to share your findings with us. But before looking into your research, I would like us to talk a little bit about some concepts. Okay?
Sounds great.
I will start with the concept of translanguaging that can be understood from a sociolinguistic perspective, and it can also be understood as a pedagogical approach. I would like you to comment on these two perspectives, please.
Sure, that sounds great. And first, I just want to say congratulations to you for the book. I'm
you.
really excited to read it and to engage with it, and hope everybody out there will do the same. But yeah, thank you again for having me. And just before I sort of dive into those concepts, a little bit about like who I am. Just for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the work, I've been to Brazil a couple of times, almost all the times to work with Antonieta.
A pleasure.
And for those of you who don't know me yet, I can tell you a little bit about my path. I started out sort of being a very tinkery kid growing up in Brooklyn, New York, here in the US, loving to use technology and computers. And I also had the opportunity to become a bilingual person through study and work and travel throughout Latin America. And then became a bilingual teacher here in New York City, as Isaura mentioned. And from there, I worked as a digital media educator, which meant I taught young people how to use digital media tools to express themselves, specifically video game design. And that's where I became interested in coding and computer science, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And so I brought those two pieces of my interest together, being a bilingual teacher and then also thinking about digital media, when I became a researcher at the Graduate Center, where I got to work with Dr. Ofelia Garcia and others on the City University of New York's team, which was focused all around the needs and strengths and unique opportunities of working with students in our school systems who are bilingual, many of whom are immigrant students or whose families might have immigrated. And now I work for Participating in Literacies and Computer Science, which is a group that, as Isaura mentioned, I co-founded to think about computer science education and bilingual education together. So with that, now maybe I can talk a little bit about the concepts. How does that sound, Antonieta?
Great, please go ahead.
All right, so translanguaging is something that I know a lot of Brazilian teachers have started to work with, and is a concept that's been bubbling up in education and in bilingual education over the last decade or so, especially though the concept sort of came from the work of Ken Williams from Wales in 2001, and then was adapted by Dr. Garcia sort of in the middle of the 2000s. And really it comes out of the idea that it sort of comes out of a history in the United States of really marginalizing students who are bilingual, students who speak languages other than English, particularly in our school system. And in the US, these immigrant students were often punished for speaking their home languages at school, and were told to speak only English. And while this might not happen per se in Brazil, there are other kinds of language policing we might think about that might happen in Brazilian schools, right? We all know the famous like red pen that teachers use to go after students for the ways they use language, whether it's correct or not. And students are told, you know, as this teacher did, to rewrite their work if it's not correct. And this has led to some kind of damaging ideologies which say that if you can't, quote unquote, speak a language correctly, then, you know, you're never going to get there. So I think about myself and kind of measuring me up against this standard. I learned Spanish as a young person. I learned it through work and travel and study and friendships. But like my Spanish will never be perfect if I'm measuring myself up against that standard. So that's the way traditional English teaching has treated language. You either have a language the way it's in the textbook, or you don't have it. You either pass the test or you don't. And so there's been some myths in education that have been pervaded, which is the idea that to be a bilingual, you have to be like two monolinguals in one. And that has been disproven over time. And we know now through a lot of research and practice that really people's linguistic practices are diverse and dynamic, and that emergent bilinguals have a single communicative repertoire. So I know, Antonia, that you were interested in this term, emergent bilinguals.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So we used to, given the sort of history that I talked about in the U.S. of denying students that that they spoke a language other than English, right? They were called traditionally in the U.S. Limited English proficient students. Which, imagine how that sounds to call somebody limited. We also used to, call these students English language learners, but that really focuses on what kids are learning, the language they're learning, and not who they are. So in the research of Dr. Garcia and some of her colleagues, she's used the term emergent bilinguals to talk about how we're all emerging in our language practices. We're all constantly developing, and also they are bilinguals as they are learning a new language at school. They're also developing, the way that they practice their language. And so we call them emergent bilinguals. So when you hear me refer to that term, it's that asset-based term to refer to a student population in our system. But we can think about not just the way that people communicate using language. This slide sort of shows you all the different ways that people communicate. So it could be through oral language, written language, gestures, sign language, music, emojis, Google Translate. There's so many different ways that people express themselves. And so if we kind of take that into account and rethink how we view what language is and how it's learned, that's where you get translanguaging. So translanguaging is this idea that it's a theory from bilingual ed that says it describes what bi-multilingual people do when they use all of the language they know, including all those things I mentioned, words, sounds, gestures, drawing, to make meaning. And we often might view in our society that the translanguaging practices of people sort of are like challenging standards. But really what translanguaging is meant to do is question the nature and politics of what makes something standard. So I like to use this image to illustrate translanguaging. So this was taken when I did some work with some colleagues from CUNY at a school in New York City's Chinatown, where students were writing about their favorite books. And the teacher gave this student the opportunity to use all of the language that they knew to express themselves. So you can see at the top, it starts with, "This is my favorite book because," and then the rest is continued in Chinese. So the student was practicing this statement of "this is my favorite book because" in English, but then the teacher said, okay, now you can write the rest of this in any way. And the student chose to use Chinese characters and also to draw a picture. And you can see that the cover of the book has some Chinese, it also has some English, and it has the image of the student themselves reading. So you can see here, language goes far beyond just English or Chinese. It's all of the student's resources.
Great. Sarah, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So some people mix up code switching with translanguaging. Is there any difference about them?
So code switching and translanguaging represent two different perspectives on how people use language. So imagine you were looking at this picture that I showed on the slide before. From a code switching perspective, you would say, oh, this student is code switching. They're using some words that look like English, and they're using some words that look like Chinese. And that's all that you would recognize. If you're looking at what the student is doing from a translanguaging perspective, you would notice all of the aspects that make it communication. You wouldn't necessarily label and say, oh, this is English, this is Chinese, this is correct English, this is correct Chinese. You would look at it for the images, you would look at it for the expression, and you would look at it for what the student is trying to say and the way that they're communicating. So it's really two different orientations and ways of viewing and looking at what students do and what they bring that goes far beyond just sort of labeling and saying, oh, this must be this and this must be that. It says that all of the language practices of a student are valid, and we're not seeking to label them.
Yeah. We can say that code switching is an external perspective of language, while translanguage is an internal perspective, right?
Exactly. And by external, we mean kind of like the way that society would view what is happening in a language practice, versus internal, which is the communication of the person. Definitely.
Great, Sarah. Would you like to go on to talk more?
Sure. Did you want to talk about how this looks in the classroom?
Yeah. So I think one of the best ways to understand translanguaging is to see and hear it in action. Yeah. Many teachers have their aha moments when they stop and listen, for example, to the way students use the language in the classroom. So I think it would be very useful to see your examples and what you have been facing in the US.
Sure, that would be great. So we think about translanguaging theory, which describes how multilingual, bilingual people use language in dynamic ways. If you leverage that theory in your classroom, you might be practicing translanguaging pedagogy. So this comes out of work, or a lot of what I'm going to tell you now comes out of the work of Dr. Ofelia Garcia with colleagues Kate Seltzer and Susana Ibarra Johnson. They wrote an excellent book called The Translanguaging Classroom, which I highly recommend that people go check out. But what translanguaging pedagogy really is it's an evidence-based approach for teaching and learning rooted in the idea that students learn best when they can leverage all of their language resources. So I actually have a video that I made a couple of years ago with one of the teachers at the Chinatown school that I mentioned earlier, which will demonstrate a little bit about how teachers can use this in their classroom. So why don't we play that video now, and then we can talk about it when we come back?
Sure. Vamos colocar o vídeo agora, pessoal?
My students speak Taishanese, Fujianese, Fukienese, Mandarin, and maybe one or two others, but most often they speak Mandarin together.
Hey teachers, welcome to Teaching Bilinguals, even if you're not one. I'm in Manhattan, Chinatown this week at PS 126, a K-8 school, where English as a new language teacher, Miss Ballantyne Berry, has been harnessing her students' bilingual superpowers by teaching them to create graphic novels. Let's take a peek inside.
I love graphic novels. I love reading them with students, in particular English as a new language learners, English as language learners. So with my lower grades, my third grade students, I read Luke on the Loose as a second graphic novel that we read together. With my older students, 5th, 6th, 7th graders, I read American Born Chinese with them. It's a little, linguistically, it's a little above their levels because they are newcomers, but because it's a graphic novel, it's really rich in pictures. And one of the characters is the Monkey King, and it's a story that the Chinese students know as part of legend and history. As I was reading the graphic novels, the students really were into them, and that made me just get really excited.
Who doesn't want to be their own superhero in a graphic novel, right?
Mm-hmm. We first started with notebook writing, and we the students had to write a checklist that I had created for them. They'd copied it into their notebooks, and it had all the different things that they needed to write about.
I noticed this part's in English and this part is in Chinese. How did you decide, or how did they decide what to do in what language?
So their likes and families, different family members are things that we've already talked about in part of our units. When a student writes in their home language, it's them trying to express themselves, and to just even at least start with that is very beneficial for them, because they at least can get their ideas across even if you can't read it, and then use that as like a springboard to like, okay, now let's focus on where we need to build their English skills. They have their introduction page, they went into their likes and dislikes. This, for example, went into like, I like to read, I like to play with my friends, and here reading, she used a speech bubble, and here she's not talking, so she used a narrator box, and that was really fun. And then when we get to her writing about her home, again, she did I am from China because it was a prompt, and then she was allowed to write in Chinese and then drew about it, and then that's where I'm able to start figuring out a little bit more of what she's writing. This was an older student. He just likes being silly, and one of his favorite words is banana, but he doesn't say it like banana, and he intentionally says banana. And when we get into the I lived in China, he said there have very much good food, but China school have very much homework. I don't like homework. When he was talking and planning, he was speaking a lot of Chinese with the other students. And then when he would write something funny like this and I like this, then he would say things like that in English. Or if he thought it was good, he would like show someone and he would say it in English.
But then he decided to actually write, this student decided to write the whole book in English. Why is that?
I think it's just his way of trying to step his game up to the next level.
To recap, during our visit to Ms. Valentine Berry's class, you heard her mention a few ways she's used students' bilingualism as a resource. In her graphic novels project, she drew on culturally relevant mentor texts. She encouraged students to use English for things she's already taught, and home language to facilitate their expression of deeper ideas. She also opened up space for students to process ideas out loud to themselves and peers in whatever language came naturally. She proves that you can teach bilinguals even if you're not one. Join us next time.
Excellent. So I hope that you enjoyed hearing from Alin, who is one of the amazing CUNY City University of New York NICEB ambassadors. So she was somebody who really worked hard to figure out translanguaging pedagogy and use it in her class. And what we see there is, well, I don't know, maybe I want to ask this first to you, Antonieta. When you've watched that video, and I know you've watched it before, like what stands out to you about what she's doing?
I think the way the teacher sees her students and how she understands their linguistic repertoire.
Yeah, that's actually one of the first parts of what translanguaging pedagogy is. So when we think about the three pieces of it, the first one is just what Antonieta mentioned, which is your stance as an educator. And in Translanguaging Classroom, and as I told you, I'm pulling this all from the Garcia et al. Book, it's the belief that students by different language practices need to be leveraged together and performed collaboratively with others, and that teachers really are co-learners with their students. And if you think about this in terms of, your own experience as a bilingual person, I never shut off who I am when I use English from who I am when I use another language, right? These practices are always leveraged together and performed collaboratively. So that's it. You really have to walk into the translanguaging classroom with that belief and not shutting down, forms or modes of expression, but building on those modes. So that's sort of the first piece of this. The second piece of this is the idea that the classroom is kind of like a river, right? It moves, it changes, it's dynamic. Kids are going to use language in all kinds of ways. And so you as an educator have to be ready to ride the wave, right? To respond to students in the moment through these shifts that you might make. Like a student is looking at you with a face that is confused. So you try using a gesture, or you try saying it another way, or you try showing an image, or maybe you say to the other student, oh, can you explain, right? There's so many different ways that we as teachers shift depending on what students do. And then the third piece is the design, which is how you intentionally plan what the classroom looks like, the different activities and assessments and strategies. So those three ideas taken together form what translanguaging pedagogy looks like. So with that, I know we had some questions. So maybe we can have Isaura ask a question on this issue of translanguaging pedagogy.
Oh, there are a lot of questions here, Sarah, for you. The first one is from Sibeli Moura, and she asks, Sarah, do you think that translanguage and immersion can be used without jeopardizing one another?
So thank you, Sibel. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah, Sibel, it's right.
Sibel. And I think they can, absolutely. It all depends on your goals as a teacher and what you're trying, when you say immersion, like where you're hoping your students go and what you hope they do. Because sure, you can conduct a class using whatever language you want to use as the teacher, but your students are always going to be translanguaging no matter what you do. They're going to use their bodies. They're going to think about things in another language, maybe jot down some notes in another language, maybe want to bring an emoji, or they're always translanguaging. And no matter what you do, no matter what language you attempt to enforce in a class, and building on those resources is really what translanguaging pedagogy is, and understanding sort of how those goals work together is at the core of what the work is. And maybe if you could show the slides one more time, I think that one of the slides I have might help answer the question. So something key to note about translanguaging pedagogy, a lot of people incorrectly assume that it's just a free-for-all, like, oh, whatever goes. That's not what translanguaging pedagogy is. It's really about thinking about your specific language objectives and supporting students' development of new language features, but also honoring and building on the language practices they bring from their homes, from their communities. And those could be communities that are not just face-to-face communities, but we know online communities, we know gaming communities, right? Honoring when a student comes in with a term from Fortnite or from K-pop, right? There's so many different ways that students use language, and translanguaging pedagogy is about fostering criticality to help students think, oh, why would I want to use this language or this language feature over that one at this time to achieve this goal, right? It's about critical thinking, but also expanding the kinds of language practices that students feel comfortable using over time.
Okay, can I ask you another question then, Sarah? It's okay. Is it okay for you? Because there are a lot of questions here and comments.
Sure.
Yeah. Igor Felipe, I love listening to my students trying to express themselves during science class using translanguage. How do I show parents that translanguage is good? They don't understand.
Well, what I would do, especially given that you're in a science class, imagine, so we're in this pandemic right now. How do you think that scientists around the world are communicating with each other to solve this pandemic? They are no doubt translanguaging. You got scientists in Asia and in South America, North America, right? Everybody trying to get a solution to this disease. They're navigating multiple language features. They're navigating scientific genome, right? Code as language in a sense. So scientists do this every day. So should your students. Your students should be using all the language resources that they have to make sense of science and to make sense of language. And so while parents might not might think, oh, my students should be constantly immersed in English. That's the only way they'll learn. That's not what the research says. And it's not how successful multilingual people in the world operate. So that's what I would say to that one.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it's also important to emphasize, Sarah, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it, that when we talk about translanguaging, we are not just talking about changing from one named language to another, but we are talking about using all our students' linguistic repertoire to make meaning in the world. Yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely. And to be successful, scientists, or to be successful, even just community members, like that's what our students have to learn how to do.
Great. Do you have any other questions, Isaura?
A lot. There are a lot of questions here.
Can I ask another question before?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Because, Sarah, many teachers are afraid of translanguaging because they think that if our students use their native language, I will use this term so everybody understands what I mean, it will hinder the development of the target language. I don't really agree with these terms, named native language and target language, but I'm using them so everybody can understand what I mean.
So that kind of goes back to that intentionality piece. I want to call attention to what Alin, the teacher in the video, was doing. She had specific objectives for students to hit around expressing themselves in the language that society would call English, right? She had those objectives. But then for certain moments, expression was more important in a sense. And so she opened up opportunities for expression using whatever language, whether that was drawing, the comic book features, using a language they might be familiar with from home, or right, all of those are ways to promote expression. So sure, the target language is key, but it's not the only part of education. And translanguaging honors that and says that using all of the language features that can support development of content and language together.
Great. Isaura, now it's your turn.
Okay,
and then we can move on also to some of the computer science.
Okay,
as well.
Great. People are very curious about your research, Sarah.
Yeah. Antonio Cabral asks, how to work with the students in this pandemic period, the practice of code switching and translanguage?
So first, I just want to highlight the idea that so code switching and translanguaging are two different theoretical lenses. Mm-hmm. And so I can talk about working with students in a translanguaging perspective. I don't necessarily want to talk about how to work with students in a code switching way, because I don't think that I'm out to teach students to say, this is the kind of language you use here, and this is the kind of language you must use here, and never the two shall meet. So in terms of working with students in translanguaging during a pandemic, this is huge. And I also want to shout out the research. And I know you're going to have a great resources page for people later, so I can send you some of these links. But an amazing scholar from CUNY, Tatiana Klein, did look into some of the promising practices of educators who are working with multilingual students during this pandemic time. So I recommend taking a look at that resource. But in terms of what I've seen, I think translanguaging is important now more than ever, because there's so many different ways to express oneself through technology, right? There's the chat, there's the emojis, there's the video, there's all these kinds of meaning that's made around when your screen is off, when your screen is on. And so supporting students to navigate the choices they have to make around not just the words that they say, but also the way that they use technology to express themselves is key during this pandemic time. There are also many ways that technology can support teachers in doing translations, using machine translation, having conversations with students about how to fix machine translation when it doesn't quite work, and being critical about when to use machine translation, when not to. There are many different ways to think about bringing in family members who are in the home and thinking about the ways they communicate because you're beaming at students right into their homes. So leveraging the ways that parents and siblings speak, and the games that kids are playing, and the language that might come from those game experiences, all of those are valuable resources that teachers can use to start designing educational experiences virtually.
Virtually, yeah.
Great. So let's talk about your research now, Sarah. And I would like you, please tell us a little bit about the prepositions you chose and what they mean, please.
Sure, yeah, I saw somebody who, I actually have these quick, we could maybe come back to this element about translanguaging in Brazil when I was there and what I noticed. And sort of the way, maybe we can end on that point about how translanguaging can help Brazilian teachers, but to sort of move into the computer science part. So as you know, as was said, the title of my dissertation was around translanguaging about, with, and through code and computing. So I think those prepositions will become clear as I talk about what this research is. But it really starts with this idea of code, right? When a lot of people view a screen like this with code on it, especially if you're not familiar with it, you might just look at this screen, get a little bit nervous. It's like a black box executing all these functions. But really, code is part of the architecture of our everyday life. It structures the way we communicate through social media, the way we transact, entertain, and even vote and take civic action, and even how we're like scammed and persuaded. So as people's lives are really mediated through code, there's a need to support young people in thinking about this code. And so in the US, there's now an initiative called CS for All, which has spread across the nation to get more young people thinking critically about code and computing, and even become creators of their own computer programs. And so I work as part of a research practice partnership in New York called Participating in Literacies and Computer Science. They're professors from NYU and from City University of New York, CUNY, who we've come together with teachers to think about how bilingual kids fit into efforts to bring computer science to all kids. And CS education can really prepare young people to become creative, ethical, and responsible writers of code. So many talk about how code is like a language. So people might say, oh, I speak English, Spanish, and Java, right? But when we sort of dig a little bit deeper into what we mean by that, we mean that code can be used to have a conversation with a computer. It can also be used when we're talking to other people about code and computers. So when we're having a conversation about the way Facebook's algorithm has caused all of us to be depressed, that might be a conversation we have about code. And then we can also have conversations through code and computers, meaning we create games, stories, animations using code to express ourselves. So my dissertation thinks about these three prepositions: conversations we have about code, with code and computers, and through code and computers. So one part of what I thought about was rooted in this idea of translation. So if you're going to look at a screen kind of like this one, how do you make sense of it? And translanguaging can help us think about that. So I take a translanguaging lens on translation. Traditionally, translation is this idea of like bridging two languages. Like I'm going to equate what's said here to what is said here. But really, drawing on the work of Garcia, Aponte, and Ley, we can think about translation as a creative practice, whereby multilingual children can use these tools that they develop in what Anzaldúa calls the borderland, right? The space between, to make sense of their worlds for their own ends. So that's anytime somebody attempts to use language to make sense of something new and different, that's really translation. So I was in a context where young people were using the software called Scratch. And I'm sure there are many teachers out there who've used this tool before. It's a really excellent authoring tool that kids can use to code their own games, stories, and animations. You can see here on the far left-hand side of the screen. Those are all the potential code you can use, and you move them to the center, and then you make the characters on the right do different things. So so students in the classrooms where I was working were all using this tool to make their own stories and games. And we can think about some of these creative acts of translanguaging that the kids had to make sense of code. So for instance, one day I was with a young person, 6th grader, so 11-year-old student, who was looking at some code. You can see the code there at the top right-hand side of the screen. And one of the code blocks there in blue says deslizar. So the code, what's great about Scratch is you can actually have the code in multiple languages. It's available in 60 different languages. And so we had it in Spanish for the kids who were in this bilingual class. And the code says deslizar. So I asked the student pointing at the code, like, ¿qué es deslizar? What is deslizar? And the student basically got up out of his chair and slid across the floor with his knees tucked under his body, and then went on to tell me, cuando tú ves que te mete así a la base. So he's describing like the act of sliding to a base in baseball. So here what we see is the student is translanguaging. He's using his body, first of all, to make sense of the code. And he's also using his knowledge of baseball and terms from baseball. He even repeated to me like he was a baseball announcer, like desliza, like slide home, to make sense of this code. So we see here that the translation, it's not just one-to-one Spanish to English. There's all these other translanguaging resources involved in helping him make sense of the code. And then as a second example, this is also from the same student. The conversation in the classroom another day was all about bugs. And anybody who's ever done computer programming knows that whenever you try to tell a computer to do something, you always get a bug. And so here, when the teacher asked, like, what is a bug, students started making connections to Fortnite. So there's two examples. One example on the top is Alvaro saying, talking about this part of Fortnite with, it's called ping, and it sort of adjusts your frame rate. It's very complicated gamer terminology that he's bringing up to describe what a bug is. And then Nikki, in the second example, uses a term from animation and talking about frames per second and how lags can happen in animation, and then making that connection to bugs. So we see that their experiences in these other domains of gaming and animation play a role in how they make sense of code. And then I think this is the last example that I have here. The student the teacher gave them code that was written in English this time, and then said, what does it mean to you? And the student asked if he could translate it, and then he's sort of giving all of these examples of, es como que va para arriba o para abajo. And these are sort of like really colloquial ways of talking about moving something up and down. And you also see how they're drawing and writing alongside that code to make sense of it. They're using lots of language resources. And then we also see all the different teacher moves that supported these acts of translation. The teacher was really open to learning about students' experiences from gaming, from baseball, from these other spaces. And then all of these literacy strategies the teacher's bringing in, like annotating code, comparing and contrasting code, unpacking new vocabulary terms as they came up. And they're really translating this code on their own terms, thus sort of bringing translanguaging together with what makes a good computer scientist, a good programmer. And yeah, we can see how students' translanguaging really went far beyond this idea of word-for-word translation. So that's sort of the work I had for you on my computing work, and would love to, I guess, answer some questions. And I also have some of those notes maybe we can save for the end about translanguaging in Brazil.
Yes, can I ask you some questions then, Sarah? It's okay for you? Mm-hmm. First of all, Djalma Vanderlei asks, how long did this project using Scratch take?
So the teachers who we work with, they're all middle school teachers, and they got to decide how long they wanted to devote to the project. So some of them decided, I want to do this once a week for an hour for the whole school year. Some of them said, oh, I only have a month to do a unit, and maybe do that every couple of days for an hour. So teachers could really decide. But the teacher who had the students create their own games, it took her about once a week from October to June. So maybe 6 or 7 months working once a week.
Okay, another question from Juliana Costa. And what age can we start teaching coding?
So I think that the CS for All community in the US has even developed curriculum for students as young as kindergarten and pre-kindergarten, using a lot of hands-on, robotics, unplugged activities that have students experimenting with patterns and making step-by-step instructions for things. So I think, as long as you're really gearing it towards your population and their developmental stage or their developmental abilities, that it can start pretty young.
May I ask another question, Tanieta, or would you like to ask? Is it okay?
What do you think, Sarah? Would you like to talk a little bit about examples of translanguaging here in Brazil?
In Brazil, what do you prefer?
Sure, maybe we can go to that and then answer some more questions that folks might have about those elements.
Great.
So let me just go back a little bit. So when I was in Brazil, I got to come across a lot of great examples of translanguaging, both sort of for online and also in person. So let me just call them up. Give me one moment. Okay. So translanguaging, oops, sorry, it's going a little bit, now it's gone too far. Sorry about that.
Do you want me to start talking about them while you find yours?
Sure.
I am going to talk about something which is very simple, and sometimes we don't even relate this practice as translanguaging. I'm going to talk about creating a multilingual ecology in the school, in your classroom. So I'll tell you a little bit about the context I was working some time ago. So I was working in a school for youth and adult education. Sarah has also visited this school. And there, out of 1,000 students, around half of them were from Haiti. So one of the first things we worried about was to create this multilingual ecology. What does it mean? Yeah. So I will talk about it right now, and I'm sure many teachers already work with that. So it was very important to make our students feel that their languages were welcome in school. So what we did is we brought the Translanguaging Corriente closer to the surface, making our students' dynamic bilingualism more visible and easier to leverage. So we started hanging bilingual posters and signs, creating multilingual word walls or cognate charts. Of course, when we make students' language visible, this may not be enough, but we are sending a clear message that they are valued and that this language, is valued and important to learning these languages. And then this is something simple that may seem very, very simple, but I guess it makes all difference. Don't you think, Sarah?
Absolutely, absolutely. Like just sending that message. And I was just reflecting, I was like, oh, wow, I wish I had put some of my slides the way I did in your workshops, sort of in all the languages that I knew the teachers would speak, especially Portuguese. So you're making me reflect on my practice in putting these slides together today. But yeah, I think it really does send that message that people's language practices are valid and they don't have to leave them at the classroom door, which I think is what happens in a lot of traditional classrooms, where people then feel like they can't bring their whole selves there.
Yeah, because sometimes when we talk about translanguaging, people, teachers, or think that we are talking about something very complicated to be done. So could you now give us other examples of what you saw here?
Sure. Well, these are just examples of like what I saw kind of in culture. Like I was doing some research and found this artist, Manu Chao, who's not even Brazilian, but I think he's French, but he uses all of these different language practices from, of course, the music and the beats and the rhythm and the instruments. But if you look at the lyrics here, right, you wouldn't be able to necessarily make a statement about what language is happening here from an external perspective, because he's communicating his sort of wanderlust, right? His position as a wanderer in society by leveraging all these different language practices in his lyrics, right? Yo no falo español, yo no falo portugués. Oh, disculpa minha gente, right? Like what? So there's a lot going on there that we can sort of think about, and how people mobilize language to make statements, political statements. And then this was from a post that I found on Facebook, which was for a taco restaurant in I think Sao Paulo. And just the way that you can see the emojis, the image, the use of the flag and Spanish and Portuguese, right? There's so much going on there that demonstrates sort of the use of language to make someone really hungry. So we see translanguaging in action, and then also just walking down the streets of certain areas in Sao Paulo. And then when I went to schools where people claimed, oh, but all of the students at this school are monolingual. But then if you were to talk to students, you'd find that their language practices go far beyond the sort of Portuguese as it looks in a dictionary, right? That the students really are using all of these repertoires. They're listening to music from around the globe. They are communicating as gamers. So I think just keeping that in mind is something important for Brazilian educators. If I were to give one tip, that, or at least from when Brazilian educators have asked me questions before. So in which ways can translanguaging help Brazilian teachers? It can help them recognize and build on all of the diverse communication practices of kids, support kids' critical thinking about language and language politics. This is something that also came up this week as I was working with some teachers, and we've had a real reckoning in our country around racial justice, which we've had issues with our legacy of slavery for, hundreds of years. But now it's kind of come to the fore with some high-profile police killings of Black people. And people thinking about language politics in relation to race has been something to come out of that, to be really clear that the way that people use language also it's something that we have to welcome, no matter what body someone inhabits, right? And then finally, being clear about the language goals. That's another thing that translanguaging can help Brazilian teachers do, to be clear about, okay, this is the language goal I have for this class now, but let's think about ways for students to leverage their resources to get there, and also to sort of express themselves in the process. So those are some thoughts I sort of had about how translanguaging can help Brazilian teachers.
Thank you, Sarah. We still have lots of questions and lots of things we would love to continue talking, but unfortunately, it's time to end. Yeah, Isaura?
Yeah, it is, unfortunately, because there are a lot of questions, comments, teachers here. So many thanks. They think it was awesome, really awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Of course, thank you.
And tomorrow we will continue this conversation about translanguaging with Claudia Hilsdorf. So it's another opportunity for us to continue this talk.
Ok. Pessoal, voltando então para mim, tem agora algumas mensagens ainda para vocês, rapidinho, bem rapidinho, tudo que é bom, né? Passou tão rápido, tão interessante esse momento com a Sara, que estamos aqui. E então eu queria falar um pouquinho de quem é a Richmond, que está aqui conosco. A Richmond é líder em soluções para a educação. Nós estamos preparados para os novos desafios da educação. Somos líderes no mercado brasileiro com prêmios internacionais de inovação editorial. Temos aqui o nosso programa Educate Bilingual Program, com mais de 170 escolas e 40 mil alunos. Uma solução estendida, que é o Richmond Solution, com mais de 40 mil alunos no Brasil e 300 mil alunos na América Latina. A Richmond atende a 1 milhão de alunos e 2.300 escolas em todos os nossos negócios. E temos essa expertise multinacional e um editorial brasileiro. É esse olhar global direcionado às particularidades do país. Nosso diferencial, por quê? Porque a Richmond, com 3 vertentes aqui, o nosso Educate by Richmond, nosso programa de educação bilíngue com 3 anos de mercado, o Richmond Solution, que nós lançamos esse ano, com esse programa de carga horária estendida, e a Richmond, com os seus materiais didáticos. Então, Richmond Solution traz uma proposta com carga horária estendida e certificação, um ambiente virtual exclusivo para professores e alunos, já com trabalho híbrido, plataforma de aprendizagem, sala de aula digital, com inúmeros recursos didáticos, jogos, atividades, vídeos, enfim. E o Educate, que já está há 3 anos, o nosso programa bilíngue, que tem uma plataforma de aprendizagem, sala de aula digital, ferramentas de blended learning, uma assessoria de marketing, uma biblioteca digital com mais de 6 mil títulos literários, sem custos extras para as famílias, um desenvolvimento contínuo de professores através de uma plataforma, consultoria acadêmica especializada, a certificação internacional para professores e alunos sem custo extra para as escolas e famílias, mais benefícios para a gestão financeira da escola e uma consultoria especializada para a melhoria da experiência do cliente. E os nossos livros didáticos também, com autores brasileiros e estrangeiros, com materiais que contemplam as particularidades do ensino de inglês para brasileiros e também com recursos de apoio ao professor, em avaliações, projetos, objetos educacionais e muitos recursos online. Falando um pouquinho dessa questão da pandemia, né, nós com a Richmond, o Grupo Santillana, a Richmond pertence ao Grupo Santillana, já estava preparado, principalmente como eu mostrei para vocês agora, em relação às plataformas digitais. Então, aqui a gente tem alguns dados das taxas de crescimento com base nos dados de acesso, né, os percentuais de crescimento das nossas plataformas de sala de aula digital, um comparativo entre o período pré-Covid e durante a quarentena. Então, em relação aos usuários, as sessões, o consumo de conteúdo, as atividades criadas quase 3.000% a mais e mensagens enviadas em fóruns. E esse plano, nós já estávamos estruturados, mas com tudo isso tivemos que nos preparar ainda mais para atender a todas as escolas, né? Tivemos mais de 900 planos de aulas assíncronas e síncronas e projetos personalizados para soluções educacionais Richmond, tanto como Educate como Richmond Solution, com entrega de newsletters semanais para todas as escolas. O Maratona.edu, que é um portal de conteúdos gratuitos para formação remota de educadores, e também da aprendizagem lúdica em família, do Grupo Santillana, com mais de 60 mil usuários, mais de 150 visualizações e mais de 20 mil downloads de e-books literários. Maratona.edu tem inglês, espanhol e todas as outras disciplinas também do nosso grupo. E a Educatrix Líderes, by Harvard Business Review, exclusiva para diretores de escolas parceiras. Então, você que está interessado, procura o nosso consultor comercial para garantir e saber como ter acesso, tá? Pensando agora na nossa campanha de retomada para as escolas, as plataformas de marketing, como diz que nós disponibilizamos para as nossas escolas parceiras. A campanha 1 é uma sinalização para as escolas pós-pandemia, com cartazes, sinalizadores, para todo o ambiente escolar, para que a escola possa se preparar para esse momento. Temos diferentes realidades em nosso país, com já alguns estados voltando. Então, já temos essa campanha também. E uma campanha número 2, que é uma sensibilização dos pais para o programa de língua inglesa. Objetivo, falar com a família sobre a importância do ensino de idioma e despertar esse interesse também pela língua inglesa. Teremos outras novidades também, como projetos aí para as nossas escolas parceiras. Também para a escola um pacote de retomada. Não podemos esquecer as habilidades socioemocionais, né? Então temos aqui um e-book de habilidades socioemocionais a partir de histórias infantis. Na verdade, é uma coleção aqui de 3 e-books da série Nós da Escola, outro de práticas pedagógicas e o da retomada segura aqui também. Bom, essa é a Richmond que apresentei para vocês. Então, se você estiver interessado em conhecer um pouco mais sobre as nossas ofertas, por favor, procure e agende uma reunião com os nossos especialistas. O link está aqui nos comentários. Ainda dá tempo, você pode ser uma das 50 pessoas que participarão de uma live exclusiva com os autores do livro Desafios e Práticas na Educação Bilíngue. O link para participar está disponível nos comentários. Então, participem e fiquem atentos. Amanhã divulgaremos os sorteados da live de hoje. E durante esta semana está acontecendo também o The Big Track Conference for Leaders, às 10 horas da manhã, com webinars exclusivos para gestores escolares. Então, ainda dá tempo de você falar com os gestores da sua escola para participarem. Amanhã, o tema será a fidelização dos alunos pós-pandemia. Qual será o novo diferencial? E assim como a Antonieta disse, nós estaremos amanhã novamente aqui, às 19 horas, para práticas translíngues na sala de aula, com a Cláudia Hilsdorf e com Antonieta. Antonieta, Sara, querem deixar uma palavra final?
So I would like to thank Sarah for being here with us. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It was really exciting to be here. I love going to Brazil more than I love doing this, but if you can't go to Brazil, this is the next best thing. So I wish all the teachers out there a lot of luck. Teachers are doing so much hard work these days. And so just, really supporting them and making sure that they stay healthy and stay well for their families and students is so important. But yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you, Sara. Thank you. Bye, bye. Tchau, tchau, pessoal. Até amanhã.
Tchau, tchau,
Bye,
gente.
Tchau.